Welcome to show your parents the PTA and the asleep don't want you to hear, the Helios blog. Today, Jordan Peterson talks about heaven. Is it supposed to be perfect?
The reason she's alone is because she's difficult.
Women are not accepting the bare minimum.
Women fuck men they respect.
All the women who say things like, I'm strong, independent, I don't need no man, like, y'all impress me.
Women just gaslight each other and say what they want to hear.
Vision of heaven at one point. Heaven was a place where people were eternally playing. And it was a place where everything was good, but everyone was playing to make it better yet. So it was a combination of what was really good, but that wasn't the end of it. And maybe that's because being itself is not good enough. You want becoming as well, right? You don't want things to be static and perfect. You want them to be as good as they can be, but dynamic, so there's still something to do. And so you could play at making things better and better. And that would be lovely if that was true, right? If you could have what you wanted, if you really think it through, you might think, well, it would be lovely if everyone could play a voluntary game that everyone wanted to play that was aimed at making things good, but even when they're good, the aim was to make them even better. And then it would even be better if when you were doing that, it was marked by a sense of, what would you say, a profound sense of positive engagement and the cessation of negative emotion. And one of the other things we do know about play is that it's quite disruptible by other motivational states. So it's not that easy for children to play if they're hungry or tired or anxious or upset or hurt. If your children are playing spontaneously, it's actually a mark that what you've created around them is a walled garden, right? The walls protect them so there's not too much chaos and uncertainty, and the garden is a place where things can flourish. A playground is a walled garden in any real sense. Walled garden, paradisa means walled garden, by the way. It's a balance between culture and nature, or between structure and possibility. You could also think about a walled garden as a game, because a game isn't you can do anything you want. A game is, here's some principles, rules you might say, here's some principles by which you can govern your behavior. Within that set of principles, here's some play, right? Some freedom to maneuver, not so much that you drown and no one knows what they're doing, just exactly the right amount so that it's playful. That's how it looks. And so back to treat yourself like you are someone you're responsible for helping. Well, you want to approach other people in the spirit of play, but I would say, even though you probably shouldn't teach people to play with themselves, so to speak, it's the right attitude to bring to bear on yourself too. And that's a hard thing to do,
Yeah, the idea is you want your internal monologue, your self-talk to be how you would talk to another person, not, overly negative.
We tend to think that most people, if we're cynical, we think, well, people are rather selfish. They're self-centered. They only want what's good for themselves. It's like, first of all, that's actually not true. There are some people who will routinely take advantage of other people to get what they want in the moment. But that's pretty rare. In its extreme forms, which would be psychopathy, let's say, in its extreme forms, it's never more than about 3% of people. And then around the psychopaths, there might be another kind of cloud of narcissists who are inclining in the same direction, but haven't got quite so far. And maybe you could add another 5% on that, depending on the severity. But it's just not the case for most people. Most people have the reverse problem. They treat themselves worse than they treat other people. And why? Well, why would you do that? Well, maybe you treat other people not so well because you think they deserve it. And why would you think that? Well, because things about them aren't as good as they could be. And that they've made mistakes. They've walked off the pathway. They've done things they shouldn't have done. And so you don't treat them as well as you might otherwise. But then you know that about yourself more than you know that about anyone else, right? You have privileged access if you want it. And even
That's right.
if you don't, you sort of have privileged access to the entire panoply of sins that you're responsible for, and that's a lot. And most people bear a pretty damn heavy burden of existential guilt. And some of that isn't warranted. Lots of times you see people in the Freudian sense who have a superego that's yelling at them too vociferously. One of the things you do in therapy for people who are hyper-conscientious to the point where their own internal voice is a tyrant is you try to moderate that. And so people can call themselves out on their misbehavior too much. But even if you don't do that, generally you have quite a lot of misbehavior. And as a consequence of that, you're ashamed and uncertain about your own value. And so then you don't think you really deserve to be treated very well. And so then you don't. And one of the things you do as a psychotherapist is, a lot of what I did, for example, people sometimes would fall into a situation where they were being terribly accused of some misbehavior by maybe in a divorce case or maybe at work, and I would help them mount a defense for themselves. It's like, we have the presumption of innocence, right? Which is a complete bloody miracle, that presumption. It's such a miracle that our legal system actually starts from that perspective, because it'd be so much easier just to say, you're accused of something? Hell, there's 20 million people in the vicinity. We don't need you. Maybe you're guilty. Off with your head. That's way simpler than, despite the fact that 40 people are coming after you with accusations, we have to assume you're innocent. God. And it's very hard to do that for yourself, to mount a defense. And one of the things I used to have my clients do if they're in such a situation is write out a defense. It's like, treat yourself like you're innocent, just for the sake of argument. We can also do the same thing on the guilt front. Maybe you should make a case.
Good practice for life is to have your defense pre-prepared.
When you're in trouble about why you're guilty as well as why you're innocent, to lay out the whole territory, but at least you should defend yourself. And then we might say also, if you think other people are worth taking care of, if you think that other people have value, well, they're individuals like you, and it doesn't seem all that plausible that they could have value and that you don't, unless you're the worst person around, and you're probably not. You're bad enough, but on average, you're no worse than everybody else. Maybe in your worst moments, you manage to climb to a new pinnacle, but generally speaking, other people are carrying a fair weight of guilt around on their shoulders. Life isn't everything it could be. That's generally not that hard to imagine. But then also imagine that there's some variation, week to week, is that maybe you're pretty damn miserable, but sometimes you're unbelievably miserable, and sometimes you're just sort of miserable. And that's not great, but at least there's some variability. One of the things you might do as a clinician, or as a friend, or as a partner, is say, well, exactly what are you doing when you're less miserable? And what are you doing when you're more miserable? Don't think about it. Watch. Like you're watching someone you don't know. This often happens with depressed people. So one of the problems with depression is it's a positive feedback loop, Because you get depressed, and then you stop seeing your friends. And even if you're introverted, there's friends you want to see, at least one-on-one, at least now and then. So now you start to isolate yourself, and then you get more depressed. And then you isolate yourself more. And then you get more depressed. It's downhill spiral, It's not good. A lot of forms of mental illness are positive feedback loops that spiral out of control. So one of the things you might do with a depressed person, they come to see you, if you're a therapist, you might say, look, just for the next week or 2 weeks or so, I want you to just keep a mood record. Maybe check in with yourself every hour, scale from 1 to 10. Just write down how depressed you are, with 10 being suicidal and 1 being as good as you get, let's say, or maybe even life is worth living. And maybe the depressed person never gets, below 6 or something, but 6 is way better than 10. And then they come back and you look and you think, oh, look, every time you were at 6 instead of 10, you were with this particular person or this set of people, or maybe you're working in your garden. Who knows, right? Or maybe if you're artistic, you were doing something artistic despite the fact that you're paralyzed by your depression. But notice your mood improved some. And then look, 10 out of 10 depressed. You're alone in your room in bed. It's like 11 in the morning. It's like, okay, so how about this? Next week, don't be alone in your bed at 11 o'clock in the morning and spend like 20% more time or 10% or 2% with your friends or doing something that seems to improve not your mood, but your state of being. And then play with that and see, can you tilt yourself gradually and incrementally, comparing yourself to who you were yesterday? Can you tilt yourself in the right direction? And then, well, that's for depressed people. You might say, well, could you do that in your life? And the answer is,
of course you could.
Yes. So the Egyptians worshiped this god, Horus, Horus. And Horus, you know Horus, weirdly enough. Everyone knows that famous Egyptian eye, with the arched eyebrow. And on the back of an American dollar bill, you have an eye that's separated from the pyramid. That's Horus as well, interestingly enough. That's the gold cap on a pyramid. It's the aluminum cap on the Washington Monument. Aluminum was more precious than gold when they built the Washington Monument. The top of a pyramid is the gold cap, and the gold cap is the eye. And what's the eye? The eye is the thing that pays attention. And so Horus was the eye, and he was the eye that could see evil and rectify it, by the way. And he was also a falcon. And the reason he was a falcon is because a falcon is a bird of prey that flies above everything and that can see. And birds of prey, they can see better than us. We're very visual animals. We have the second best visual systems of any animal. Birds of prey see better than we do. They can see clearer and farther. A falcon, if a falcon was on top of the Empire State Building, he could see a dime on the pavement below. They're unbelievably sharp-eyed. And ancient people knew this. They hunted with birds of prey and they watched them. They knew they had spectacular vision. And so they used the falcon as an image of redeeming vision. And they associated redeeming vision with the sun setting and rising, because the sun shines when you can see. And so that's a solar god. And that's the hero that fights the dragon at night and that comes up victorious in the morning. A very old idea. That's all associated with vision. And vision pays attention. Assume that the person you are listening to might know something you don't. That doesn't mean everything you don't, and that might mean
that is almost invariably the case.
Hardly anything at all, but maybe you could glean something, and because you're clueless and confused, anything you glean might be useful, and so it's useful to attend, like in a manner that's infused with humility. Why humility? Because you need to know that what you don't know is more important than what you do know. That's a hard thing to learn, because you want to fortify what you know, man, because it feels protective, and it's very threatening to move on the periphery of what you know. But there's a lot of what you don't know, a lot, and you need to know it. And what attitude do you need to bring to bear on what you don't know? It's like, pay attention. There might be something there for you. And so then you attend to yourself, and that ties us back up to the first rule, which is treat yourself like you're someone who you might be responsible for helping.
Indeed.
Well, what does that mean? Like you don't know who you are. Because you don't. As if you're someone made in the image of God, let's say. Someone, despite your flaws, of divine intrinsic value, who could hypothetically be a light on the hill. Hard as that is to believe. And then watch and see when you're where you should be. And maybe you're only a bit of the way there, and you're kind of, your life is hell to purgatory, that's it. There's very little glimpse of paradise, but purgatory beats the hell out of hell. And so maybe you can move from hell into purgatory, that would be something, and maybe when you're there, now and then, you're getting a little bit beyond that. You think, right at this moment, for whatever reason, I'm not doing something so terrible that I'm in hell. What is going on? What's the circumstance? What did I allow to happen that made this possible. It's a form of awakening in the most profound sense, to notice when that happens. Then you think, could I be there more often? 1% more often.
Actually, pretty interesting principle, which is the self-reflection is what actually makes you happy. You pay attention to your own experience and then use that paying attention to feedback loop self-improve.
That compounds very quickly. If it's 1% a week for a year, you're going to be there like twice as long in a year as you were before you started. And God only knows how good you could get at that if you didn't do anything other than that, let's say. If you really committed to that, God only knows what your life could be like in 5 years or 10 years. Maybe you could be in that state all the time. And who knows what effect you'd have on you and your family and the people around you if you were in that state. And that's something worth thinking about too. And maybe that's a good thing to close. We have this notion, developed not least in your great country, that people have an intrinsic worth, that we're sovereign citizens, that we're all possessed of a voice that redeems the state. That's why we have an inalienable right to free speech, let's say, because we're a necessary corrective to the blindness and archaic nature of the state. We're the living eyes of the dead king. And maybe that's really true. Then you think, well, if the world isn't everything you want it to be, set your house in perfect order before you criticize the world. If the world isn't everything that you want it to be, maybe you're not acting the way you should. Because there's some intimation in our deepest ideas that the weight of the world rests on your shoulders. Now, that's a terrible thing to think. But maybe it's true. And it's an open question. How much of the mess that you see around you
is your fault?
Would vanish if the mess that you could put straight was put straight? And you know this too to some degree, because to the degree that you've not become entirely embittered and cynical and hopeless, you know perfectly well that if you put your mind to it and you make the proper sacrifices, there are things you can set straight. And that if you do that diligently, things actually improve. And so, because otherwise, if you didn't believe that, you wouldn't act at all. Maybe you just turn to completely catastrophic, short-term, impulsive pleasure, something like that. You have to believe that your action has some redemptive possibility, because why would you do it otherwise? And you might say, well, I kind of believe that. It's like, well, that's not good enough. You kind of got to throw yourself all into it. And what's the cost anyways? It's not like you're going to get out of this alive. So you're pretty much all in, whether you want to be or not. And maybe if you were voluntarily all in,
things would improve.
Irishmen are such an excitable bunch. It's always fun to come to Dublin. I think it's probably too much fun to come to Dublin, actually. Yeah, so it's really remarkable to see you all here, and appreciate, as I always do, appreciate the fact that you've all taken the time and expended the effort to come and see this. I thought I would wander through the 24 rules, and I don't know how many I'll address, but we'll see how it goes. So maybe we'll start with a rule from the first book, 12 Rules. Treat yourself, this is rule number 2. Treat yourself like you are someone you are responsible for helping. That's a hard one. There's an injunction, a moral injunction, that you should treat other people like you would like to be treated yourself. The golden rule, let's say. And rather than he who has the gold makes the rules, right? That's not an injunction to sacrifice yourself in some unending way for the benefit of other people, which is often how it's interpreted. And it's not that. It's advice in relationship to reciprocity. And this is something really worth knowing. I've been thinking about this for a long time, because I got interested in the nature of malevolence and motivation for atrocity. I got interested in the nature of evil. And certainly as a consequence of studying atrocious behavior at the clinical level, and then also at the political and economic and sociological level, I definitely became convinced that it's a very naive person indeed who doubts the existence of evil. I think it's easier to become convinced of the reality of evil than it is to become convinced of the reality of good. It's easier to define evil than it is to define good. But if you can specify the nature of evil, you help yourself infer the existence of good, because you can say to yourself, you can
Whatever moves away from that.
conclude that whatever good is, difficult though it may
bad.
be to put your finger on it, it's the opposite of evil. I did have this inkling, way years ago when I taught at Harvard, I was teaching about very dark things, about individual motivation for the sort of acts that characterized, say, the worst atrocities of the Holocaust and the catastrophic situation with regards to Stalinist Russia. Those were the two places I focused on the most. And I had this voice in the back of my head always when I was lecturing, very serious lectures, that if I could really manage those lectures properly, I would do it with a sense of humor. And I thought, that just cannot be right. How in the world can you deal with a topic that dark in a manner that's
Light.
playful? I thought but the voice wouldn't go away. And I knew there was something to it. And so I've been trying to think about how do you concisely conceptualize the opposite of evil? How can you tell when things are going in the opposite direction? If there's a malevolent spirit that might inhabit you if you walk down the darkest possible road, what would be the opposite of that spirit if it was inhabiting you, so to speak, if you were walking down the most positive of roads? And I would say, I do believe this to be the case, that's play. So, children play, and it says that there's a gospel statement that unless you become as little children, you'll never enter the kingdom of heaven. That's a very complicated statement. It means in part to regain the pristine perceptions of wonder that you had as a gift in some sense when you were a child. If you have children, young children, you get to partake in that if your eyes are the least bit open, because one of the things that's absolutely wonderful about young children and having them around, and the way in some sense they pay you for the painstaking care that you need to exercise when you're caring for them, is that they enable you to see the world through fresh eyes and to see things in their untrammeled by cynicism glory. And
Very interesting.
it's hard to open yourself up to that, especially if you're an adult who's built layers of shells around yourself for any number of reasons. But children offer you that opportunity. And so one of the reasons that you should become as a little child is so that you can see miracles when they unfold in front of you instead of being blinded by your own defensive cynicism. And children can definitely help with that. But also, children play. And we sort of stop playing as we grow older and we think we mature out of it, but that's not right. What happens is that we can no longer do it. And a lot of that, I think, is associated with the shock of puberty, because you have to integrate sexuality into play. And that's really hard. It's really challenging for people, partly because you're more likely to be rejected on the sexual front, for example, and that's very hard on people. And then also it's a more dangerous game, that's for sure. And so it's a big challenge. And a lot of people stop playing when they're teenagers. One of the reasons I think that we've had somewhat of an explosion of unhappiness and mental illness, particularly among women, by the way, over the last 30 years, is because a lot of what we've done inadvertently has interfered with children's ability to play. And so, for example, it's very hard for boys to play in school because almost everything they're required to do is antithetical to the rough and tumble ethos of masculine play. That's really hard on young boys. And with young girls, I was talking, I believe it was to Jonathan Haidt recently, a famous psychologist in the United States, and he said that girls have almost stopped doing patty cake and skipping and that sort of thing. And these are deeply embodied forms of play that might be something like the female equivalent of rough and tumble play among males. And that rough and tumble play is a form of embodied dance, because if you're wrestling, and fathers really like to do this with their kids, and kids really like it, and they really need it. It teaches you the extent of your body, it teaches you how to twist your body and to push it to its limits and to expose yourself to fear. Maybe your father throws you up in the air and catches you. Can you imagine someone doing that to you as an adult? 12-foot high person just tosses you in the air and catches you. It's no wonder children sort of scream with terror and delight, but they do.
Because it's a safety net, right? It's the definition of
safety. And they really, you just can't believe how much they need that to engage in that play. Because they also learn what hurts them and what doesn't, because the most fun, direct physical play with kids pushes them right to the ragged edge of disaster, right? It's right where it almost hurts that it's most exciting. And partly what you're doing when you're playing is calibrating it to make sure that it's as exciting as possible, but not too exciting. And
Indeed.
The rough and tumble play is deeply embodied. It's not just abstract, right? It involves pain and anxiety and excitement and frustration and turn-taking and attention. It's very sophisticated, and that's just on the rough and tumble front. And then later, as kids develop, they start to engage in pretend play. And there's no difference between pretend play and thinking. They are the same thing.
There you go. So you're thinking in many different environments, effectively. Cool. Okay. We're going to end the video there. Hit the like, hit the sub, hit all the notifications, drop me a donation like Hunter M, Adrian L, Tom and Bobby, Dylan, Renaissance Press, Brian, Andrew, and Alan. Shout out to you, most recent purchaser of Strategist Guide to Seduction. Go buy my books at bit.ly/heliosbooks. If you'd like early access to my content, it's offered on my Patreon. That's patreon.com/theheliosblog. And if you're looking for coaching, for good advice, just message me at theheliosblog@gmail.com. That's my email. I'll slot you right in. Thank you so much for listening, guys, especially for listening to the end. I really do appreciate it. Take care of yourselves, and I'll see you next time.